The wind hit the valley at almost minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and every log cabin for miles cracked under the frost. Every cabin, except one, a hollow carved into solid rock, sealed with nothing but bales of straw, stood through 5 days of the worst storm the region had seen in a decade. And inside, the fire never went out. No iron stove pumping out heat. No double walls of seasoned oak. Just stone, straw, and a stubborn man everyone in the valley had already written off. They called him reckless. They called him cheap. Some said he was building a barn, not a home, and that the first hard freeze would prove them right. It didn't. Something inside that rock hollow held heat in a way no one in the settlement could explain. Not the neighbors who watched their wood piles vanish in 3 days. Not even the men who had built their cabins exactly by the book. What he understood, and what almost everyone else missed, wasn't in the fire. It was hidden in the walls themselves. By the end of this story, you'll know exactly what he packed into that stone, why straw outperformed timber when it mattered most, and how 5 brutal days in the decade's worst storm finally settled who was right. If you're watching this from somewhere cold tonight, drop your location in the comments and subscribe, because this isn't the last forgotten frontier trick we're going to dig back up. By the time Ezra Voss reached the Ozark foothills in the early autumn of 1887, most of the good bottomland was already claimed. What was left to him was a steep, rocky parcel along a limestone and sandstone ridge, ground that other settlers had walked past more than once, judging it unfit for a proper homestead. There was barely enough flat ground for a garden, and what timber remained standing was scattered, thin, and far from where a man would need to drag it. Local land records from the county clerk's office list his claim as 40 acres of broken, stony upland, a phrase used more than once to describe parcels nobody else wanted. Oral accounts passed down through families in the hollow describe Voss differently. Not as a man who'd been forced into bad land, but as one who had specifically gone looking for it. What drew him wasn't the dirt. It was the rock. Halfway up the ridge, a deep sandstone overhang cut into the hillside, 18 feet wide, set back nearly 14 feet from its open face, with a ceiling that rose just over 7 feet at the back wall. It faced almost due south, angled to catch the low winter sun for most of the short daylight hours. Generations of weather had already hollowed it out long before Voss ever saw it. Most settlers in the region, when they staked a claim, spent their first 6 to 8 weeks felling timber. A standard one-room cabin in that part of the Ozarks called for somewhere between 60 and 90 logs, depending on the builder's standards and the size of the room. A brutal amount of cutting, hauling, and notching for one man working alone, especially with the first frost only weeks away. Voss did the arithmetic differently. With the season already turning and no extra hands to help him, a full log cabin built from scratch wasn't a question of skill. It was a question of time he didn't have. The rock hollow, on the other hand, already had 3 solid stone walls and most of a roof. What it lacked was a front. To his neighbors, the decision looked less like strategy and more like surrender. A respectable homestead, in their eyes, meant cut and notched logs, a stone chimney, a door that swung on iron hinges. Building into a hole in a hillside, whatever the reasoning behind it, looked like something closer to a root cellar than a home. Voss never spent much time explaining himself. According to accounts collected later from families who farmed nearby, he answered questions about his cave house with little more than a shrug and a comment about saving his strength for the part of the work that actually mattered. He had already started hauling straw bales up the ridge before the first hard frost, long before anyone in the hollow understood why. What none of them yet realized was that Voss wasn't simply taking a shortcut around a log cabin. He was building towards something else entirely, a structure that didn't need 60 logs and a stone chimney to survive a hard winter, because the hardest part of the work had already been done by the mountain itself, centuries before he ever arrived. Word travels fast in a settlement of a few hundred families, and word about Ezra Voss traveled faster than most. By the time the first wagons of winter supplies came through the hollow that November, nearly everyone along the ridge had heard some version of the story. A man living in a hole in the rock, propped up with bales of straw instead of proper timber. Local accounts from the period are blunt about the reaction. One neighbor, recalling the talk decades later to a county historian collecting oral histories, remembered the general mood simply as everybody figuring he'd freeze before Christmas. Another family's recollection, passed down and recorded in the 1930s as part of a regional folklore project, described Voss's place as closer to a pig pen than a parlor, a comment apparently common enough at the time that it stuck. The mockery wasn't only about appearances. It carried real weight in a community where a man's home reflected his judgment, his industry, and his fitness to be trusted with anything that mattered: a loan, a land deal, a daughter's hand. A log cabin, however small, signaled that a settler understood the work required to survive on the frontier. A straw-sealed rock hollow signaled, to most onlookers, that he either didn't understand it or didn't care. There were practical objections too, and not unreasonable ones. Straw was known across the region mainly as livestock bedding and roof thatch, material associated with barns, not homes. It held an obvious reputation as dangerously flammable, breaking down quickly when wet, and offering, in most settlers' experience, only a thin and temporary kind of shelter. Stacking it against an open rock face, in the eyes of men who had spent years building with timber and stone, looked less like an unconventional choice and more like an invitation for disaster. Some neighbors offered, half out of genuine concern and half out of curiosity, to help Voss fell enough timber for a proper front wall before the weather turned. Oral testimony suggests he turned the offers down more than once, repeating that he had what he needed and that the straw would do exactly what it was meant to do. To men who had never used straw bales as anything but bedding, the statement made little sense. What none of them accounted for was scale. Voss wasn't loosely piling straw against an opening the way a man might block a drafty barn door. He was assembling something closer to a wall in its own right, bales stacked, compressed, and bound with a deliberateness that, from a distance, looked almost identical to ordinary carelessness. By the time the first true cold settled over the ridge in early December, the talk in the hollow had mostly turned from curiosity to quiet, confident prediction. Nearly everyone agreed on how the story would end. Almost none of them agreed on why Voss seemed entirely unbothered by their certainty. To understand why Voss chose that particular hollow, and not simply any outcropping along the ridge, it helps to understand what the rock itself was doing long before any settler arrived. The Ozark uplift exposed layers of sandstone and dolomite across much of the region, and weathering over thousands of years carved shallow shelters into softer bands of stone wherever water and wind found a weak seam. Local geological surveys conducted decades later identified the formation behind Voss's claim as a coarse-grained sandstone, several feet thick at its shallowest point along the back wall, thickening toward the sides where the hollow narrowed into the hillside. What set this particular shelter apart wasn't simply its size, though 18 feet of usable width was generous for a natural formation. It was the orientation. The opening faced just east of due south, catching direct sun for most of the daylight hours through the low winter months, when the sun at that latitude rarely climbs more than 30 degrees above the horizon. A shelter facing north or west would have spent the coldest months in near-permanent shadow. Voss's faced the one direction that mattered most. There was also the matter of depth. At nearly 14 feet from the open face to the back wall, the hollow was deep enough that its interior air rarely felt the direct sting of wind gusts crossing the ridge, gusts that, according to records from a nearby weather station established later in the century, regularly exceeded 35 miles per hour during winter storms in that part of the Ozarks. The rock itself, simply by virtue of its shape, was already doing something a flat log wall never could: absorbing and breaking the wind before it ever reached the living space. None of this was accidental on Voss's part, even if he never described it in those terms. Local accounts describe him spending the better part of 2 days before he ever touched a straw bale, simply walking the hillside, checking different hollows along the same ridge, apparently dissatisfied with several formations that looked, to an untrained eye, nearly identical to the one he eventually chose. What he was looking for, though no one watching him at the time understood it, was a structure where the hardest, slowest part of staying warm through an Ozark winter, had already been solved by several feet of solid stone, sun exposure, and a shape that broke the wind before it ever became his problem. The straw, when it finally went up weeks later, wasn't meant to replace what the rock was already doing. It was meant to finish it, and that distinction, invisible to almost everyone in the hollow, was the detail his neighbors kept missing every time they laughed at the bales stacked against the open face of his hillside home. Once Voss settled on the hollow, the work that followed bore almost no resemblance to anything his neighbors recognized as cabin building. There was no felling of 60 or 80 logs, no weeks of notching joints by hand, no raising of 4 walls from the ground up. Instead, according to accounts passed down through families who later farmed the same ridge, Voss spent roughly 10 days on a structure that, from a distance, looked deceptively simple: a wooden frame across the open face of the hollow, packed solid with straw. The frame itself was modest: rough-hewn poplar studs, spaced roughly 24 inches apart, set into shallow notches cut directly into the sandstone on either side of the opening. A single doorway was framed near one edge, narrow enough to limit heat loss, with a small window opening near the opposite corner position to catch what little afternoon light reached that side of the ridge. The frame took perhaps 2 days to complete, working alone with hand tools. What came next was the part that drew the most ridicule. Local oral histories describe Voss hauling roughly 130 to 150 bales of wheat straw up the ridge over the better part of a week, using a sled rigged behind his only mule. Each bale, by the standards of the era, weighed somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds, meaning Voss moved, by a conservative estimate, well over 3 tons of straw up a steep grade before a single bale went into place. The stacking itself followed a method that looked, to onlookers, almost identical to building a haystack against a barn wall, except far more deliberate. Bales were laid in overlapping courses, much like brick, with each layer offset from the one below it to avoid creating a single weak seam running through the wall. Gaps between bales and between the straw and the timber frame were packed tightly with a clay and ash mortar mixed on site, a technique not unlike the chinking used in standard log construction, but applied here to bind straw rather than timber. By the time the wall reached its full height, it measured close to 2 feet thick at its narrowest point, nearly 3 times the thickness of a typical hewn log wall used elsewhere in the hollow. A rough lattice of split saplings was lashed across the exterior face, partly to protect the straw from wind-driven rain and partly, according to one account, so it would look like he meant to do that, a comment that suggests at least some self-awareness on Voss's part about how the structure appeared to outsiders. To the men walking the ridge road that fall, the finished wall looked exactly like what they expected. A barn wall stood up where a cabin front should have been. What none of them stopped to consider, even as they shook their heads and went back to their own wood piles, was the simple, almost embarrassing fact that wheat straw, packed and compressed the way Voss had packed it, already had a well-documented reputation, however unfamiliar to most settlers, as one of the most effective insulating materials available on the frontier. They had walked past the answer for weeks. They had simply never thought to ask the right question about why. By the time the straw wall stood finished against the mouth of the hollow, Voss had built something far more sophisticated than his neighbors gave him credit for. Though built, understates how much of the structure's real strength came from material that was never assembled by his hands at all. The first half of the system was the rock itself. Sandstone, like most dense stone used in vernacular construction across the frontier, absorbs heat slowly and releases it just as slowly, a property builders of the era understood instinctively, even without the vocabulary to describe it as thermal mass. Through the short daylight hours, direct winter sun striking the south-facing opening warmed the exposed stone of the back wall and ceiling by several degrees, the rock acting almost like a battery that charged through the afternoon. After sunset, as outside temperatures fell, that same stone released its stored warmth slowly back into the room, smoothing out what would otherwise have been a sharp drop the moment the sun disappeared. A standard log cabin couldn't do this in the same way. Hewn logs, however well-fitted, carry only a fraction of the mass of several feet of solid sandstone, and they release whatever heat they hold far more quickly once a fire dies down. In a typical settler's cabin, the gap between a roaring fire and a cold room could be measured in a single hour. Inside Voss's hollow, that gap stretched considerably longer, a difference his neighbors would later struggle to explain, having never considered that the walls around them were doing thermal work of their own. The second half of the system was the straw. What looked from the outside like crude bedding material packed against a frame was, in practice, an extraordinarily effective barrier against heat loss. Tightly compressed straw traps countless small pockets of still air between its fibers, and still air is a poor conductor of heat, a principle modern building science would later confirm in measured terms, showing straw bale walls performing several times better at resisting heat flow than an equivalent thickness of solid timber. Where a log wall let warmth bleed steadily outward through the wood itself, Voss's 2-foot straw wall resisted that loss far more effectively, foot for foot. Put together, the two materials solved two different problems at once. The rock prevented the kind of fast temperature swing that came from drafts and a dying fire, holding a slow, steady core of warmth deep in the hollow. The straw prevented that stored warmth from simply escaping out through the one open face of the structure, the way it would have through any ordinary wall. Neither material, on its own, was unusual. Settlers across the region understood rock. Farmers everywhere understood straw. What none of them had considered, and what Voss appeared to grasp instinctively, whether through experience, observation, or simple trial and error, was that combining the two, in the right proportions and the right location, created something closer to a single working system than two separate building materials. The mountain held the heat. The straw kept it from leaving. And the fire, when Voss lit it each evening, had far less work left to do than anyone watching from a distance ever imagined. The first hard frost reached the ridge in the second week of December, dropping temperatures to somewhere near 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, cold enough, by most accounts, to settle the matter for good in the eyes of Voss's neighbors. Smoke from his small fire had been rising steadily from the hollow for weeks, visible from the ridge road below, and more than one passerby assumed it was simply a matter of time before that smoke stopped rising altogether. It didn't. What neighbors noticed instead, almost reluctantly, was a pattern that didn't match their expectations. Local accounts describe Voss splitting noticeably less firewood that December than men working similarly sized cabins nearby. By some recollections, roughly half, as much over the same stretch of weeks. A standard one-room log cabin in the region typically burned through several armloads of split wood a day to hold off the worst of the cold, with fires needing near-constant tending through the night. Voss, by contrast, was seen building his fire once in the evening and letting it burn low by morning, without the frantic restocking that defined most households on the ridge through the coldest mornings. Skeptics had a ready explanation. He was simply freezing quietly and hadn't said so. A few neighbors, more out of curiosity than concern, found reasons to pass close enough to the hollow to glance inside when Voss wasn't looking. What they reported back, according to oral histories collected generations later, was less dramatic than anyone expected. No frost on the walls, no shivering, nothing that matched the picture they'd built in their minds since October. Voss kept his routine simple and largely unremarked upon, which made it harder for the skeptics to argue with. Each evening, he built a modest fire near the front of the hollow, close enough to the straw wall to warm the room, but set back far enough, according to careful measurements he reportedly insisted on, to keep any stray spark well clear of the bales. The fire burned for 2 to 3 hours after dark, fed steadily, then allowed to die down to coals as he settled in for the night. By most settler standards, it was an alarmingly small amount of attention to pay a fire expected to carry a household through an Ozark night. What the doubters were witnessing, without quite understanding it, was the system already doing what Voss had built it to do. The sandstone walls, having spent the brief daylight hours absorbing what sun there was, held a low, steady warmth that the straw wall refused to let escape. The fire wasn't carrying the household through the night by itself. It was simply topping off a system that was already most of the way there before the first log ever caught flame. By the time Christmas passed without incident, The mood in the hollow had shifted from confident prediction to something quieter and less comfortable. Not quite respect, but no longer the easy certainty of October either. The real test, as everyone along the ridge well understood, hadn't arrived yet. December cold was inconvenient. What was coming next was something else entirely. The storm that struck the ridge in late January was, by every local account collected afterward, the worst the region had seen in more than 10 years. County weather records compiled later in the decade describe a sudden Arctic front dropping temperatures from a relatively mild 28 degrees Fahrenheit to nearly 18 below zero in under 24 hours, accompanied by sustained winds local accounts place at 40 to 50 miles per hour, gusting higher across exposed stretches of the ridge. The cold held, with only minor relief, for nearly 5 straight days. For most households in the hollow, those 5 days became a grim test of endurance. Firewood that had been carefully rationed through December disappeared at a pace nobody had planned for. Local recollections describe families burning through what should have been a week's supply of split wood in under 2 days, forced to send men out into dangerous wind chill to fell and haul more, sometimes more than once during the worst of the storm. Water left in buckets near interior walls froze solid overnight in more than one cabin. Livestock losses were reported on at least 2 nearby homesteads. Animals caught without adequate shelter as the temperature collapsed faster than anyone had prepared for. Inside standard log cabins, even well-built ones, drafts through gaps in the chinking became impossible to ignore once wind speeds climbed past 30 miles per hour. Fires that normally held a cabin at a tolerable temperature struggled to keep pace, consuming wood at 2 to 3 times the usual rate just to hold steady, rather than gain ground, against the cold pushing in through every seam in the walls. Up at Voss's Hollow, conditions outside were no different. The same wind, the same brutal drop in temperature, the same 5 days of unrelenting cold. What was different was what that cold encountered once it reached his straw wall. According to accounts gathered later from a neighbor who checked on Voss midway through the storm, more out of genuine worry than curiosity at that point, the interior of the hollow held at a temperature neighbors estimated, by comparison with their own fires and experience, at somewhere close to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even as the fire itself had been allowed to burn low for several hours beforehand. The wind, which tore through gaps in conventional log walls all along the ridge, simply couldn't find a way into Voss's 2-foot-thick barrier of compressed straw. And the sandstone at his back, having held a slow, steady reserve of warmth through the relatively milder weeks leading into the storm, gave it reserve up gradually across the worst of the cold, rather than letting the room's temperature collapse the moment the fire dropped low. Voss, by most accounts, didn't add significantly more wood to his routine during those 5 days than he had through an ordinary December week. Weathering the worst storm in a decade with roughly the same modest fire he'd been building since the first frost, while less than half a mile down the ridge, his neighbors fought a losing battle against drafts, dwindling wood piles, and a cold that found its way through walls built exactly the way everyone agreed a proper cabin should be built. When the storm finally broke in early February, what remained on the ridge told 2 very different stories. Several cabins had visible damage, split chinking pulled apart by repeated freeze and thaw stress. At least one roof partially caved under accumulated snow weight that a weakened structure could no longer support evenly. Firewood supplies across the hollow were, by multiple accounts, nearly exhausted, with more than one family forced to borrow from neighbors barely better off than themselves. Voss's straw wall, by contrast, showed remarkably little wear. A handful of bales near the base had compressed slightly further under their own weight and the added moisture of blown snow, but the wall held its shape, its thickness, and, most importantly to the men who'd mocked it for months, its function. There was no structural failure, no point at which the wind or cold had simply overwhelmed it the way drafts had overwhelmed conventional walls along the ridge. What convinced the skeptics, according to several oral accounts that circulated for years afterward, wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a quieter, cumulative realization. Neighbors comparing notes in the weeks following the storm pieced together a rough picture. Voss had burned, by conservative estimate, somewhere between a third and half the firewood that comparable households had consumed over the same 5 days, while maintaining an interior temperature that several visitors independently described as noticeably warmer than their own homes during the worst of the cold. One account, recorded decades later as part of a regional oral history project, described a neighbor walking into Voss's hollow partway through the following week and remarking, with evident surprise, that it felt closer to a mild fall evening than the tail end of the worst storm in 10 years. The comment was passed down specifically because of how at odds it was with what that same neighbor had predicted back in October. There was no single laboratory measurement to point to, no official record of exact temperatures logged hour by hour inside either Voss's hollow or his neighbor's cabins. What existed instead was something arguably more convincing to the community itself. A shared, lived comparison, drawn from 5 days when everyone on the ridge had faced the identical storm, the identical cold, and the identical wind, and one household had come through it using a fraction of the fuel, with no structural damage, and by several accounts, considerably more comfort than anyone expected from a hole in the rock stuffed with hay. The mockery that had followed Voss since October didn't vanish overnight, but it changed in character. What had been confident ridicule became, for many of his neighbors, a harder question to sit with. If a stack of straw in a hollow in the rock had outperformed 60-notched logs in a stone chimney through the worst storm in a decade, what exactly had the rest of them gotten wrong? By the time the snow finally retreated from the ridge in early March, the story of Ezra Voss's winter had already spread well beyond the handful of families who'd watched it unfold. According to several oral accounts later collected by regional historians, travelers passing through the county that spring carried the story to neighboring settlements, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes stripped down to little more than a man who beat the worst storm in years with nothing but hay. What mattered more than the story spread, though, was what happened closer to home. A neighbor identified in later recollections only as Hiram Beckett, whose own cabin had lost roughly a third of its winter woodpile during the January storm, was reportedly among the first to ask Voss directly how the straw wall had been built, rather than simply repeating second-hand rumors about it. According to family accounts passed down through Beckett's descendants, the conversation that followed was less a grand revelation than a practical, almost mundane exchange. How thick the bales needed to be stacked, how the clan ash mortar was mixed, how far back from the wall a fire needed to sit. Beckett didn't rebuild his cabin. Few settlers, having already invested months of labor into standing log walls, were willing to start over from nothing. What he did instead, according to the same family accounts, was apply a smaller version of Voss's approach to his root cellar that spring, packing straw bales between the cellar's earthen walls and its wooden door frame, in a method clearly borrowed rather than independently discovered. By the following winter, Beckett stored potatoes and turnips reportedly survived a hard freeze that had ruined a portion of at least one other family cellar nearby. Word of small experiments like Beckett's spread through the hollow more easily than word of Voss's original cabin ever had, perhaps because a root cellar carried none of the social weight a home did. Nobody judged a man's character by how he insulated his turnips. Over the following 2 or 3 winters, local accounts described straw packing showing up in a handful of other outbuildings across the ridge. A smokehouse here, a spring house there, even in one case, a gap between an existing cabin's logs and a newly added lean-to. Voss himself, by most accounts, remained a somewhat private figure on the ridge for years afterward, respected in a quiet, almost reluctant way by men who had spent the better part of a season laughing at him. He never wrote down his methods, never claimed credit beyond what neighbors gave him directly, and according to one later account, seemed almost uninterested in being proven right, having apparently expected the outcome all along. What changed wasn't a sudden community-wide conversion to building rock and straw homes. It was something smaller and more durable, a willingness, after one brutal storm, to look twice at an idea that had been dismissed on sight, and to ask for once what the man building it might actually understand that the rest of them didn't. Looking back on Ezra Voss's winter from more than a century's distance, what stands out isn't simply that an unconventional structure outperformed a conventional one during a single severe storm. It's how completely ordinary the underlying principles turn out to be once they're named directly, and how thoroughly modern construction has drifted away from using them at all. The two ideas at the center of Voss's Hollow, thermal mass that stores and releases heat slowly, and insulation dense enough to keep that stored heat from escaping, remain foundational concepts in building science today, taught in introductory courses on passive design and energy-efficient construction. Contemporary straw bale homes, built deliberately rather than out of frontier necessity, are recognized in modern building circles for insulation values that routinely exceed conventional stick frame walls, sometimes by a significant margin. The Ozark Ridge, where Voss built his hollow, never produced a textbook. It produced a working demonstration decades ahead of the vocabulary that would eventually describe it. What's changed since Voss's time isn't the physics. Sandstone still holds heat the same way it did in 1888. Compressed straw still traps the same pockets of insulating air. What's changed is how often modern construction prioritizes speed, uniformity, and low upfront cost over the kind of site-specific thinking Voss applied almost by necessity. Choosing a south-facing hollow over a north-facing one, packing a thick wall instead of thin one, working with a mountain shape rather than flattening it to build something standardized. Much of contemporary homesteading and off-grid building, in fact, has begun circling back toward exactly this kind of thinking. Not out of nostalgia for the frontier, but because the underlying physics never stopped being sound. Builders today, experimenting with straw bale walls, earth-sheltered structures, or thick masonry thermal mass, are, in a real sense, rediscovering what a stubborn settler on an Ozark Ridge worked out through trial, observation, and a refusal to do things simply because everyone else did them that way. None of this should be read as a literal building guide. Straw bale construction, rock hollow shelters, and historical chinking carry real risks. Fire safety, structural load, moisture management. That vary by region, material quality, and craftsmanship, and that modern building codes address for good reason. What Voss's winter offers isn't a blueprint to copy directly. It's a record of an idea. That comfort and survival in harsh conditions have always depended less on how much material a person could afford, and more on how well that material's behavior was understood. This account is presented as a historical and educational reconstruction drawn from local records and oral testimony, not as engineering instruction, and it should never substitute for professional building codes, structural assessment, or modern safety standards. By the time the next hard winter reached the ridge, Ezra Voss's Hollow was still standing exactly where it had always been, quiet, unremarkable from a distance, and, for anyone willing to look closely enough, still holding the same simple lesson it had offered from the very first frost. Sometimes the wisest thing a builder can do is stop fighting the land and start listening to what it's already offering for free.